Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you. Today's asynchronous lesson is all about identifying and evaluating rhetorical fallacies. So this lesson builds upon our previous lesson about identifying and evaluating rhetorical appeals to ethos, pathos, and logos. Today, we're going to look at the ways that mistaken or manipulative appeals to ethos, pathos, and logos can constitute rhetorical fallacies. So along the way with this lesson, you'll need to take out the handout with the lesson slides that you received during our meeting on Tuesday. If you didn't come to class on Tuesday, or if you misplaced your lesson slides, you can pause here and print from the Canvas page. You can print this resource out. It's helpful because during the lesson, you can annotate the slide handout to note down ideas and details that come up in the voiceover, or you can add details and examples from your own thoughts, as well as writing down questions or areas that you'd like further clarification on. In addition to the slide handout, you'll also need to take out the examples that I provided during our Tuesday meeting. This is like a front and back page with examples that illustrate common rhetorical fallacies. Once you're set up, let's begin. If you're the note taker for today's lesson, as always, don't feel pressured to copy everything down. Instead, use your best judgment to just write down the key details and the key ideas. This lesson will cover, first of all, what is fallacious reasoning, and then we'll go over some ways to recognize concrete examples of fallacies for ethos, pathos, and logos. So starting off, getting a context and a framework for what are fallacious arguments. One way they can appear is if speaker, writer, or thinker accidentally makes mistakes in their reasoning process or in their argument structure. So fallacies aren't always so insidious. They can simply just be mistakes and accidents. In addition, if an argument is developed with insufficient evidence, insufficient explanation or commentary, it could be seen as a hasty generalization or an oversimplification. Or if arguments include misleading and manipulative evidence, explanation, or commentary, if any source is overly manipulative, it is deemed to be fallacious. It's important to begin to recognize, identify, label, and evaluate fallacies of ethos, pathos, and logos, because the best defense against being misled or manipulated is to make ourselves aware of some of those common fallacies in order to really identify them when we read, watch, or listen to arguments and ideas, and importantly, to avoid them when we develop and express our own arguments, thoughts, and ideas. As we start to look at the examples for each kind of fallacy, I'd like to introduce a word of caution. Many fallacies are labeled with idioms or metaphors or figures of speech. So it will help in your notes if you expand upon what you see just here in the slides to add some kind of examples that can clarify and illustrate these concepts in a way that makes sense for you. So as we're always striving in this class with our critical thinking, to not rely overly on metaphors, idioms, or figures of speech, and instead always striving to bring clarity and precision into our language use. In addition to that, another word of caution is that since we're using idioms and metaphors to label these types of fallacies, there are multiple possible ways that you can label each kind of fallacy. So in this lesson, we'll look at some common ways that we label, describe, and identify certain types of fallacies. And in the supplemental handout, that one page front and back that has examples of common fallacies, you'll see a slightly different taxonomy or a slightly different labeling system to express the same kind of fallacy. So it's not mutually exclusive. It's not, one way is superior or inferior. There just happens to be difference within this discourse community of critical thinking as to how we want to label, describe, and identify specific forms of fallacies. And then finally, oftentimes when we're going through the examples, we'll look at the way fallacies can be used in one way only, usually with like negative connotations and negative argumentation. But it's important to keep in mind that fallacies can work both ways. So not only can there be mistakes or manipulations when writers, speakers, and thinkers criticize or disparage ideas, there can also be mistakes and manipulations when writers, speakers, and thinkers advocate for certain ways of thinking. So always be on the lookout for the fact that fallacies can work in both ways. Okay, with that out of the way, we're going to jump into looking at specific categories that help us classify types of fallacies. So make sure that you are prepared and ready to engage with active thinking. And without any further ado, let's jump into it. As we get started, we're going to begin by identifying fallacies of ethos. These are often termed as ethical fallacies. So fallacies of ethos happen when an argument mistakenly appeals to a source without proper credibility, or when an argument relies on attacking or applauding others rather than attacking or applauding their views and arguments. So remember, rhetorical strategies that appeal to ethos are all about credibility, authority, and expertise. So when we misuse appeals to credibility, authority, and expertise, we are committing ethical fallacies. Let's take a look at some of the examples. Namely, this happens through abusing sources. So one example is false authority. So appealing to unreliable or illegitimate sources, or appealing to vaguely defined sources. So one way that we can appeal to false authority is by calling upon quotations or references to sources that actually do not have any credibility or expertise in relation to the focused topic that you're on. So maybe you're appealing to evidence from a medical expert when you're speaking about a legal topic, and you can see how that would be kind of an illegitimate connection. Similarly, vague sources like experts agree or politicians argue against. So you can see how that kind of use of reference to vague or undefined sources could constitute an ethical fallacy. Again, ethical in terms of appeals to ethos, not in terms of morality or justice. Another example is the bandwagon appeal. So this kind of appeal to the authority of tradition or popularity, common sense, or conformity. So that idea that obviously everybody thinks this way, so that means it must be right, would be an appeal to the bandwagon appeal. Appeal to ignorance, claiming that your argument is supported or valid simply just because there's no evidence against it, would be an appeal to ignorance. A lack of proof against your topic is not support for the truth and value of your topic, of your stance. Just because you are not able to find somebody with an opposing argument is not sufficient reasoning to claim that your argument is most valid. Also, appeal to hypocrisy. So we can say that if we undermine somebody's argument because they don't practice what they preach, or they don't live up to the advice or the stance that they're putting forth, again, is not a valid source for arguing against somebody's viewpoint. Similarly, as we were mentioning before, fallacies work both ways. So you couldn't say an example like, we should all drive electric cars because the president drives an electric car. Or the president's argument that we should drive electric cars is valid because they themselves drive an electric car. You can see the example in the handout. It lists it in the negative context, like, the professor's argument that we should drive electric cars is false because they don't drive an electric car. It works both ways. So whether you're using this appeal to hypocrisy, or an appeal to whatever the opposite of hypocrisy is, authenticity maybe, it can go both ways. So just be cautious when you're reading through other people's viewpoints and arguments, looking at why they're using reasoning to support their view and making sure that it's not an appeal to false authority, the bandwagon approach, appeals to ignorance, or appeals to hypocrisy. Another way that we can see the ethical fallacy or fallacies related to incorrect or insufficient use of credibility, authority, and expertise are some techniques for manipulating the argument. The straw man fallacy is one of the most prominent or iconic fallacies. So pretty much this functions when you deliberately misrepresent somebody's viewpoint in order to refute or undermine that replica that you created. So you sort of deliberately misunderstand the point that somebody is making, and then you argue why that representation is false. And then we also have the fallacy of association, and I'm going to try to emphasize the way that this works in both ways. So firstly, by discrediting a source or discrediting an argument by linking it to unpopular ideas, unpopular people, or unpopular types of activities. So this is wrong because the wrong kinds of people do it. And it works the opposite way too. If you are crediting a source or crediting an argument by linking it to popular people, ideas, and activities. So saying this is the right way to think because the right kinds of people are doing it. So is a fallacy of association. We also have poisoning the well. This is when we incite prejudice against a source so that we discourage people from considering their viewpoints. So maybe we say people who are educated at Harvard are brainwashed and indoctrinated into these types of ideologies, so we can't believe a word that anybody says if they graduate from Harvard. An example like that. And remembering too that you can poison the well, and then I don't know, the common rhetoric for talking about fallacies is really in the negative. So I don't know how we would say the opposite of this, but like enchanting the well, I don't know, but remembering too that it works both ways. And then the ad hominem fallacy is basically when you attack or disparage the author, so the speaker, the writer, the thinker, rather than disparaging or attacking the argument that they put forth. This person's argument is wrong because they're mean, is kind of, the most simple way to illustrate that. So those are about 8 examples for appeals of fallacies of ethos. So insufficient, mistaken, or manipulative appeals to credibility, authority, or expertise. Pause here, look back at your notes, see if you have questions, comments, thoughts. I especially think it would be helpful if we use the discussion space in Canvas to share examples that illustrate these kinds of fallacies. So anything you can think of on your own that kind of illustrates or provides an example for these fallacies, I think would be a really helpful addition to the lesson. And when we're ready, we're going to move on. Next, we're going to take a look at emotional fallacies. So these are fallacies of pathos or pathetic fallacies. And these types of fallacies happen when an argument elicits unfair or exaggerated emotional responses, or when an argument seeks to distract or confuse the audience, shifting the focus away from the issue at hand. So remember, rhetorical strategies that appeal to pathos are motivated by emotions, values, and beliefs. So fallacies of pathos happen when we mistakenly or manipulatively target our reader's sense of emotions, values, and beliefs. Let's take a look at a few examples. So more or less this happens when the writer, speaker, or thinker seeks to manipulate our emotions. Appeal to emotions is one of the most informal, common ways that we can see the pathetic fallacy. And more or less we have to evaluate when a source is trying to influence our views, attitudes, and receptions of an argument by triggering an emotional response. We have to use our judgment when we evaluate whether an appeal to pathos is reasonable rhetorical technique or whether it goes too far. And the idea of the emotional response overshadows the balance of argument that appeals to logos, ethos, and pathos in a balanced way. So just having an appeal to emotion is not a fallacy of pathos, but if, as a critical thinker, we judge that appeal to be overboard, then we might call it an emotional fallacy. Another way that we see these manipulations of the emotion is through loaded questions. Loaded questions are inquiry strategies that are based on leading toward biased values and biased assumptions. So I believe in the handout, I don't have it in front of me. I guess I'm a bad student. In the handout, I believe there's the example of the question, can selfish and self-interested politicians really be trusted to take meaningful action toward an issue that we care about? And you can see how asking that kind of question or framing that kind of inquiry will naturally lead toward biased outcomes because of the loaded language that is used to ask the question. And then also remembering too that it can work both ways. So if your question has a lot of positive bias, it's going to have a similar fallacy. We then have the slippery slope fallacy. These ones are a little easier to identify too because the argument is based on exaggerating the consequences of an argument. And it can be either used to frighten and whip people up into a frenzy, or it can be used to imagine like overly utopian and exciting outcomes. So whether your argument is positive or negative, and whether it's like a slippery slope into utopia or dystopia, it's something to be aware of when we're evaluating the nature and quality of arguments that we read during the research process. Next, we have the red herring, and this is a pathetic fallacy, a fallacy of emotions, beliefs, and values, when the writer, thinker, or speaker shifts the conversation to begin discussing off-topic or unfocused claims and examples that distract our attention away from the main argument. So when somebody brings up a totally random example or a totally random topic to shift the focus away from the main issue at hand. So these are our examples of emotional fallacies. Take a moment here, look at your notes, look at the handout, the one with all the examples on it, and pause the video and share into the discussion space if you'd like to emphasize or spotlight on some fallacies of pathos, mistaken or manipulative appeals to emotion, value, and belief. Maybe you want to share out an example to illustrate this type of fallacy, or maybe you have questions, comments, or you'd like further clarification. So use the discussion space to share thoughts, ideas, questions, and then we'll move on. The final category for classifying types of rhetorical fallacies comes into logical fallacies. So if we remember that rhetorical strategies of logos appeal to valid reasoning, proof, careful patterns of reasoning, careful connections between claim, reason, evidence, interpretation, analysis, etc. With that in mind, just a refresher of what is a logical appeal, thinking about how logical fallacies happen when an argument either has mistaken connections moving from one point to another in an illogical way, or illogical connections between claim and reason, reason and evidence, evidence and interpretation, evidence and analysis. So either when somebody is moving from point to point in an illogical fashion, or when somebody's developing their point in an illogical fashion. So let's take a look at some examples of how these can happen. The most common fallacy of logos comes from hasty and oversimplified thinking. So just an informal, common way that we can encounter the logical fallacy is in overgeneralization. So overextending your observations and assumptions about individuals and categories. So saying like, oh, I observed this one example, so that must mean all of these other examples carry the same assumptions and observations and outcomes. So pretty basic at overgeneralizing. Presenting that false dilemma. So presenting an issue as in like black and white or as binary oppositions, painting this picture, creating this illusion that there are only two options and they're both diametrically opposed. This divisive kind of logical fallacy is very common in American politics. So if you're searching for examples that you'd like to share in the discussion space to sort of bring these things to clarity, almost anything in American politics is very black and white, diametrically opposed, either or, completely ignoring a third possibility or completely ignoring the idea of like compromise. We also have false analogy. So equating two things, basically suggesting that one thing is exactly like another, or suggesting like, since these two things are similar, all of our understandings, assumptions, and analysis from part A can equally apply to help us understand, assume, and analyze about part B. So sort of ignoring the meaningful differences or the meaningful complexities between two options and treating them as they are identical when in fact they are not. And then also hasty conclusions. This is very similar to an overgeneralization. So we jump to conclusions about an entire group or an entire category based on limited observations or a limited number of examples. Saying something like, students never do their homework because I know for a fact that these two students haven't done any of the reading, so therefore I can generalize that students never do the reading. Or all students use tutoring. I know this because I saw these two students using tutoring, so therefore I know that all of them use it. Very common, very easy to identify a hasty conclusion like that, or similarly an overgeneralization. We'll look at one more category for logical fallacies. These are a little bit more complicated, but the faulty logical pathways. So moving from one thing to another. A non sequitur is kind of one of the more common fallacies of logos. It's pretty much saying like, okay, I'm going to describe this evidence and these examples, and then I'm going to make a claim that's kind of related to something else entirely. So it says drawing a conclusion based on unrelated evidence. So just because you gave valid evidence doesn't necessarily mean that the claim you're making is logically connected to the validity of that evidence. It's hard to think of an example for this one without seeing it, so maybe somebody out there can share it in the discussion replies. And one way that we can recognize this when we're doing our research is just if somebody made a claim and they shared some evidence and then their analysis doesn't really match up to that evidence they were talking about, then you know that they didn't really support their claim. Just because they said it after the evidence doesn't mean it was in fact logically connected to the evidence. Similar to that is post hoc reasoning, confusing a sequence of events with cause and effect. So just because I observed thing A, B, and C happening one right after another doesn't necessarily mean that thing A caused thing B caused thing C. So thinking carefully to distinguish whether something has occurred just as a matter of sequence and coincidence, or whether there is a truly reasonable cause and effect connection. We also have the genetic fallacy. So this is a claim that something is true or right just because it has been accepted and realized throughout history or reinforced by traditions. So claiming that something is good, true, right, fair, just because it has always been so would be an example of the genetic fallacy. And there are other ways that this can happen too. So saying that something is bad or wrong or like false just because it's new or just because it goes against traditions and norms is another way of using the genetic fallacy. Or saying that things are best and better and most right because they are new, because they are up to date, because they are recent. So the genetic fallacy can happen a lot of different ways. We just have to be attentive in our study when we see an argument's validity being connected to time and history. And we have to think to ourselves, are there other supporting reasons? Or is the basis of this argument just because it has to do with the sequence of time? So keeping that in mind as well. And finally, we have the idea of circular reasoning, and this one is pretty easy to identify. It can sometimes feel similar to the non sequitur. Pretty much you're using the conclusion or the opinion, you're using the claim to support itself. Usually this appears by the use of like synonyms. If you have like water is wet because it moistens your skin, wet and moist are the same thing. So that's just circular reasoning. A lot of times too, it comes hand in hand with the non sequitur. We'll have a claim, some kind of evidence that really doesn't prove the claim, and then you restate the claim, acting as though you've proved it. I can't think of any reasons. I'm sure you guys can think of some good examples for circular reasoning, but pretty much you're just saying, it's like using the definition using the word to define itself. Like a fallacy occurs when reasoning is fallacious. So it's circular reasoning, it's circular logic. Okay, I think that's it for our lesson today. For follow-up, I'm going to ask that we possibly reread or review some of our previous research. So we have our definition, concept research, and we have 1 to 2 sources of opinions, viewpoints, and arguments, offering perspectives toward your topic. So if those sources are at hand, I would encourage you to reread through them to see if you can identify any rhetorical strategies and techniques that you didn't catch the first time around, or now that we have a new vocabulary for rhetorical fallacies, anytime we have mistakes or manipulation connected to ethos, pathos, or logos. Maybe review the research that you've already done and see if you can spot anything like in there. And then also a reading from the textbook. Chapter 2 is a catalog or a refresher of reading strategies. It helps us sort of clean up our techniques for academic reading. And there is a section on recognizing fallacies. So now that we have a little bit of a primer and a little bit of vocabulary, that part of the chapter will make a little bit more sense. And other than that, as always, make sure to review the Canvas modules and reach out during support hours. If you have questions, comments, thoughts, you can just drop into the Zoom or come into the SSE Center and we can work on these assignments and these concepts together and make sure that you're heading down the right path with your research and your topic development. Other than that, you guys take care, have a good rest of your week and weekend, and I will see you when we meet again on Tuesday. Bye.